The flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness, illuminating a patch of dirt floor in the corner of a dilapidated farmhouse outside Ad-Dar, Iraq. American soldiers stood in a tight perimeter, weapons raised, night vision goggles scanning for threats. As a CIA operative named Chris knelt beside what appeared to be a styrofoam plug covered with dirt and a frayed rug. It was December 13, 2003, 8 months after the fall of Baghdad, and every lead for 6 months had ended in disappointment. Dry wells or ambushes. Chris placed his hand on the styrofoam, feeling warmth rising from below, and in that moment realized they had finally found him. Somewhere beneath this concealed opening, in a hole barely large enough for a man to lie down, was Saddam Hussein, the butcher of Baghdad, who had murdered hundreds of thousands, tortured his own people, and evaded the most intensive manhunt in modern military history. The hunt had begun officially on March 19, 2003, when cruise missiles struck Baghdad in an attempt to kill Saddam in the war's opening hours. But the dictator had already disappeared into a network of safe houses, tunnels, and loyal supporters that he had spent decades cultivating. The massive conventional military invasion that followed toppled his regime in weeks, scattering the Iraqi army, dismantling the Ba'athist government, and reducing his palaces to rubble. Yet Saddam himself remained a ghost. Coalition forces captured Baghdad on April 9th, pulling down his statue in Firdos Square while the world watched, but intelligence indicated he had fled the capital days earlier, possibly to Tikrit, his ancestral hometown where tribal loyalty ran deeper than fear of American firepower. The CIA's Special Activities Division, the agency's paramilitary arm that operated in the shadows of conventional warfare, took primary responsibility for the manhunt, deploying teams throughout the Sunni Triangle with a single mandate: find Hussein before his continued freedom became a rallying point for the insurgency already forming in Iraq's devastated cities. The man leading the intelligence effort was a CIA operations officer named Kelly, who had spent 20 years running assets in hostile environments from Afghanistan to Colombia. He arrived in Baghdad in April 2003 with 12 ISID operators, setting up operations in one of Saddam's former intelligence facilities, a building still bearing scorch marks from American bombs and bloodstains from the regime's interrogations. Kelly understood that conventional military tactics would not locate Saddam. The former dictator had survived decades of internal coup attempts, Iranian assassins, and American bombing campaigns by trusting almost no one and maintaining operational security that rivaled any intelligence service. He moved constantly, never staying in one location more than a night, communicated only through trusted couriers, and maintained multiple layers of security between himself and anyone outside his innermost circle. Finding him would require penetrating that circle, identifying the men Saddam trusted absolutely, and turning them against the leader they had served for decades. The challenge was both practical and psychological. Saddam had built his power structure on a foundation of tribal loyalty, family connections, and strategic brutality that kept potential betrayers terrified of the consequences. His inner circle consisted primarily of men from Tikrit and surrounding villages, members of the Abu Nasir tribe, who had benefited enormously from Saddam's rule, receiving government positions, military commands, and wealth extracted from Iraq's oil revenues. These men had participated in his regime's worst atrocities: the Anfal campaign against the Kurds that killed tens of thousands, the suppression of the 1991 Shia uprising that murdered thousands more, and the routine torture and execution of anyone suspected of disloyalty. They knew that cooperating with Americans would brand them as traitors, not just to Saddam, but to their tribe, their families, and the Sunni community that saw the American invasion as an assault on their power and identity. Convincing them to betray Saddam required offering something more compelling than money or safety. It required understanding what they feared more than Saddam's revenge. Kelly's team began by mapping Saddam's support network, identifying every bodyguard, cousin, tribal leader, and former government official who might have knowledge of his whereabouts. They cross-referenced names from Ba'ath Party records captured during the invasion, interrogation reports from thousands of prisoners held at camps throughout Iraq, and intelligence provided by Iraqi exiles who had fled Saddam's regime years earlier. The result was a database of over 300 individuals, organized in concentric circles radiating outward from Saddam himself. The innermost circle contained approximately 20 people: his sons Uday and Qusay, his personal secretary Abd Hamid Mahmoud, his half-brothers, and a handful of bodyguards who had protected him for decades. The second circle included 50 tribal leaders and former intelligence officers who might provide logistical support or safe houses. The outer circles contained hundreds of Ba'athists who might have indirect information or connections to the inner network. Kelly's strategy was to work from the outside in, capturing or recruiting lower-level supporters, using information they provided to target progressively higher-value individuals, squeezing the network until someone close enough to Saddam either betrayed him or made a mistake that revealed his location. The first major breakthrough came in June 2003, when a former Republican Guard colonel named Mahmoud was captured at a checkpoint outside Tikrit. He had been carrying $90,000 in American currency and a satellite phone containing numbers that intelligence analysts linked to known Ba'athist cells. Under interrogation, Mahmoud initially refused to cooperate, insisting he knew nothing about Saddam's whereabouts and expressing confidence that the American occupation would collapse within months, allowing the Ba'ath Party to retake control. His interrogator, a CIA officer named Sarah who spoke fluent Arabic and had studied Iraqi tribal culture extensively, took a different approach than the aggressive questioning Mahmoud expected. She sat across from him in the holding facility, offered tea, and asked about his family. The question caught Mahmoud off guard because it was personal rather than tactical, acknowledging his humanity rather than treating him as merely a source of intelligence. Over several hours, Sarah learned that Mahmoud had 3 daughters and 2 sons, that his oldest daughter had been studying medicine at Baghdad University before the invasion, and that his family was now hiding in a village north of Tikrit, terrified that Ba'athist loyalists would kill them for Mahmoud's capture, while equally afraid that Americans would imprison them for their association with the regime. Sarah recognized the opening and exploited it with precision that was both compassionate and calculating. She explained that Mahmoud faced decades in prison unless he provided actionable intelligence, that his family would receive no support or protection while he was detained, and that his daughter's dreams of becoming a doctor would die in the chaos-consuming Iraq. But if he cooperated, if he helped locate high-value targets, and demonstrated genuine commitment to ending the violence, his family could be relocated to safety. His daughters could continue their education, and he could eventually rejoin them, rather than spending the rest of his life in a cell. The offer was not manipulation. It was a genuine exchange. Mahmoud's information could save American lives and Iraqi civilian lives by hastening Saddam's capture and deflating the insurgency, and in return, his family would receive the protection and opportunity they deserved. It took Mahmoud 3 days to decide. He spent those days alone in his cell, weighing loyalty to a regime that had already fallen against responsibility to children who depended on him. On the third day, he told Sarah he would cooperate, but only if she promised his family would be protected before he provided any information. Sarah made the promise and kept it, arranging for Mahmoud's family to be moved to a secure location within 48 hours. The intelligence Mahmoud provided was significant, but not immediately actionable. He confirmed that Saddam had fled Baghdad before the invasion, that he was moving between safe houses in the Tikrit area, and that communication with him was handled exclusively through couriers who changed constantly to prevent surveillance. Mahmoud identified 5 men he believed were still in contact with Saddam, including Mohammed Ibrahim Omar al-Muslit, a cousin who owned farmland outside Ad-Dawar, and a bodyguard named Qais, who had protected Saddam for 15 years. He provided physical descriptions, family connections, and details about their properties that allowed Kelly's team to begin targeting them for capture or surveillance. Most importantly, Mahmoud explained that Saddam's inner circle was fracturing under pressure. The dictator's sons, Uday and Qusay, had reportedly argued with their father about strategy, with Uday advocating for fleeing to Syria, while Saddam insisted on remaining in Iraq to organize resistance. Money was becoming scarce as frozen assets and captured cash reserves limited the regime's ability to pay loyalists. And fear was spreading through the network, as American raids captured or killed more associates each week, making everyone wonder who would be next and whether cooperation might offer better survival odds than continued loyalty. Kelly used Mahmoud's information to plan a series of raids throughout June and July, targeting the individuals identified as potential links to Saddam. Some raids yielded nothing, finding abandoned houses or families who claimed no knowledge of their relatives' whereabouts. Others resulted in firefights as Ba'athist loyalists chose death over capture, barricading themselves in homes and fighting until American soldiers killed them, or they detonated suicide vests rather than face interrogation. But slowly, methodically, the raids produced additional intelligence. A captured courier revealed that Saddam's messages were being passed through a network of taxi drivers who moved between Tikrit and surrounding villages. A former bodyguard admitted that Saddam was changing locations every 36 to 48 hours, never staying anywhere long enough for informants to report his presence and coalition forces to respond. And a tribal leader, facing life imprisonment for financing insurgent attacks, confirmed that Saddam was not living in comfort, but moving between crude safe houses, sometimes sleeping in cars or underground hiding places, reduced from the opulence of presidential palaces to the existence of a fugitive whose power had collapsed around him. If you're still watching this hunt unfold, if you understand that some missions require turning enemies into allies and patience into precision, go ahead and like this video and comment the word betrayal below. Let's see how many of us recognize that the greatest intelligence victories are won, not through force, but through understanding what people fear and what they love. The intelligence breakthrough that would ultimately lead to Saddam came from an unexpected source in late July 2003. American soldiers raiding a villa in Mosul killed Uday and Qusay Hussein after a 4-hour gun battle that saw Saddam's sons refuse surrender despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Their deaths eliminated 2 of the few people Saddam trusted absolutely. But more importantly, documents recovered from the villa included handwritten notes that intelligence analysts traced to Saddam's personal secretary, Abid Hamid Mahmoud. The notes referenced the old man and included coded references to locations around Tikrit, providing the first hard evidence that Saddam was indeed hiding in his tribal homeland, rather than having fled to Syria or another country. Kelly recognized that the deaths of Uday and Qusay had fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the manhunt. Saddam's inner circle now knew that loyalty would not protect them, that American forces would find them eventually, and that the regime they had served was truly finished rather than temporarily displaced. The question was how to convert that knowledge into actionable betrayal. Kelly focused on Abd Hamid Mahmoud, identifying him as the linchpin between Saddam's daily movement and the support network keeping him hidden. Mahmoud had served as Saddam's personal secretary since the 1980s, managing his schedule, handling sensitive communications, and maintaining the operational security that kept the dictator alive through decades of threats. He was family, married to one of Saddam's cousins, and had enriched himself substantially through corruption and embezzlement that Saddam tolerated as a reward for loyalty. Intelligence indicated Mahmoud was still in regular contact with Saddam, possibly serving as the primary courier, coordinating movements between safe houses. If Kelly's team could capture Mahmoud, they would have someone who knew exactly where Saddam was hiding. But Mahmoud was also sophisticated enough in counterintelligence to avoid patterns that would make him easy to locate. The search for him became a hunt within the hunt, consuming resources and attention while Saddam remained free, and the insurgency grew stronger each week. The operation to capture Mahmoud required patience and tradecraft that blended signals intelligence, human sources, and predictive analysis of tribal behavior. Kelly's team identified Mahmoud's extended family, mapping relationships to fourth and fifth cousins, and placed surveillance on their homes, businesses, and social gathering places. They intercepted phone calls, analyzed travel patterns, and cultivated informants who reported gossip and rumors circulating through Tikrit's tribal networks. The work was tedious and often fruitless, generating thousands of hours of recordings and surveillance reports that revealed nothing about Mahmoud's location. But in mid-August, an informant mentioned that Mahmoud's elderly mother was ill and receiving visits from relatives at her home in Tikrit. The detail was minor, the kind of human information that bureaucratic intelligence systems often overlooked. But Kelly recognized it as exactly the kind of vulnerability that might draw Mahmoud out of hiding. Family obligation, particularly to a dying mother, could override operational security even for someone as disciplined as Mahmoud. Kelly positioned a surveillance team near the mother's house, using Iraqi assets who could blend into the neighborhood without arousing suspicion. For 11 days, the team observed relatives coming and going, documenting each visitor, photographing faces, and noting arrival and departure times. On August 17th, a man matching Mahmoud's description arrived at the house driving a taxi, accompanied by another man who appeared to be providing security. The surveillance team alerted Kelly, who immediately deployed a capture team consisting of SAD operators and Army Special Forces soldiers. They surrounded the house quietly, establishing perimeter security before moving in. When they breached the door, Mahmoud was sitting beside his mother's bed, holding her hand. The security guard reached for a pistol, but was shot twice before he could raise it. Mahmoud made no attempt to resist, raising his hands and saying in English that he surrendered, apparently recognizing that his run had ended, and that whatever came next would be determined by what he chose to tell his captors. The interrogation of Abd Hamid Mahmoud became the most critical intelligence operation of the manhunt. Kelly personally oversaw the process, bringing in specialized interrogators, psychologists who understood Iraqi culture and tribal dynamics, and intelligence analysts who could verify information Mahmoud provided against existing databases. They held Mahmoud at a secure facility outside Baghdad, treating him correctly under international law while making clear that his cooperation would determine whether he faced trial for crimes against humanity or might eventually see reduced charges. Mahmoud was defiant initially, insisting that Saddam would return to power, that the insurgency would drive Americans from Iraq, and that those who betrayed the regime would face execution when Baathists reclaimed control. His confidence was genuine, reflecting decades of witnessing Saddam survive seemingly impossible situations through brutality, cunning, and the belief that willpower could overcome superior force. But as interrogators patiently dismantled his assumptions, showing him evidence that the regime was permanently destroyed, that his sons were dead, that his assets were frozen, and that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, regardless of American withdrawal, Mahmoud's certainty began cracking. The breakthrough came when interrogators shifted from discussing Saddam to discussing Mahmoud himself, specifically the fortune he had accumulated through corruption. Intelligence had tracked millions of dollars Mahmoud had embezzled from government accounts, deposited in foreign banks, and invested in properties throughout Europe and the Middle East. Interrogators presented him with documentation of these assets, explaining that they had been frozen by international sanctions and would be seized unless Mahmoud demonstrated cooperation that justified clemency. They also mentioned his children, 3 sons and 2 daughters living in Jordan under assumed names, and suggested that their futures depended on their father's choices in this room. The approach was psychologically sophisticated, framing cooperation not as betrayal but as pragmatism, as a father protecting his family's future, rather than clinging to loyalty that would destroy them along with him. Mahmoud spent 2 days considering his options, withdrawn and uncommunicative, before finally asking what specifically the Americans wanted to know. When told they wanted Saddam's location, Mahmoud smiled bitterly and replied that Saddam trusted no one with his exact location, not even his secretary, because the dictator understood that anyone could be captured and made to talk. But Mahmoud explained that although he did not know precisely where Saddam was at any given moment, he knew the system Saddam was using to stay hidden. The dictator was moving between approximately 15 locations, all within a 30-mile radius of Tikrit, all owned by tribal relatives or loyalists who owed their wealth to the regime. Saddam communicated through couriers who carried handwritten messages, never using phones or radios that could be intercepted. He never announced his movements in advance, sometimes changing destinations en route if he suspected surveillance, and he relied on a small security detail, no more than 4 bodyguards at any time, because large groups attracted attention and increased the risk of informants. Mahmoud provided names of the couriers he knew, descriptions of several safe houses he had visited during the 1990s when coordinating Saddam's movements, and details about the tribal leaders most likely to be sheltering him. The information was valuable, but not sufficient to pinpoint Saddam's current location. It narrowed the search area and identified targets for further surveillance. But capturing Saddam would still require either extraordinary luck or someone even closer to him, choosing betrayal over loyalty. Kelly's team used Mahmoud's intelligence to intensify operations around Tikrit throughout September and October. They raided the properties he identified, sometimes finding evidence of recent occupation but never catching Saddam himself. They captured several couriers, interrogating them and occasionally turning them into double agents who fed disinformation to Ba'athist networks while providing Americans with intelligence about insurgent activities. They increased payments to informants, offering rewards up to $25 million for information leading to Saddam's capture, flooding the area with leaflets and radio broadcasts that advertised the bounty and encouraged betrayal. The pressure was relentless and cumulative, designed to constrict Saddam's freedom of movement, reduce his resources, and create paranoia within his support network. Kelly knew that every captured courier, every raided safe house, and every frozen bank account made Saddam more isolated and his remaining supporters more nervous. Eventually, someone would make a mistake. Someone would decide that $25 million in safe passage out of Iraq was worth more than loyalty to a fallen dictator, and that person would provide the final piece of intelligence that ended the hunt. The mistake came in November, when a tribal leader named Namik made contact with an American patrol near Ad-Dar. Namik was a minor figure in Saddam's network, a cousin several times removed who owned farmland and occasionally allowed Ba'athist fugitives to hide in his properties. He approached the patrol nervously, speaking in broken English, saying he had information about high-value targets, but would only discuss details with senior intelligence officers. The soldiers brought him to a forward operating base, where CIA officers debriefed him for 6 hours. Namik explained that he had been sheltering mid-level Ba'athists for months, charging them money for safety, but was now terrified because insurgents were pressuring him to store weapons and launch attacks against Americans from his property. If he refused, they would kill him as a coward. If he complied and was caught, Americans would imprison him. He saw cooperation as his only survival option, offering information in exchange for protection and relocation for his family. The intelligence officers were skeptical initially, accustomed to informants exaggerating their knowledge to increase their value. But Namik provided specific details that verified against existing intelligence, suggesting he genuinely had access to Ba'athist networks. When asked whether he knew anything about Saddam's location, Namik hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences of what he was about to say. Finally, he admitted that a courier had visited his farm 3 weeks earlier, delivering money to a neighbor and mentioning in passing that the president was staying nearby and needed supplies. Namik had not asked questions, knowing that curiosity about Saddam's whereabouts could get him killed. But he had noticed increased activity around certain properties, cars arriving at unusual hours, men standing guard in fields that normally had no security. He identified 2 specific locations where he suspected Saddam might be hiding periodically: a farmhouse owned by Mohammed Ibrahim Omar al-Muslit, and a small compound near the Tigris River owned by another distant cousin. Intelligence officers cross-referenced the names against Mahmoud's information and existing databases, confirming that both men were indeed connected to Saddam's inner circle. Kelly authorized intensive surveillance of both locations, deploying satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human observers to monitor activity around the clock. For 3 weeks, the surveillance produced frustratingly little. The properties showed minimal activity, occasional vehicles arriving and departing, but nothing suggesting Saddam's presence. Kelly began wondering whether Namik had been mistaken or deliberately misleading, feeding disinformation to collect reward money without providing actionable intelligence. But on December 11th, satellite imagery showed unusual activity at the al-Muslit farm. Several vehicles arrived within a short period. Individuals moved between the main house and outlying buildings, and infrared sensors detected heat signatures suggesting more people were present than the property normally housed. Kelly ordered ground surveillance teams to move closer, using Iraqi assets who could approach the property without arousing suspicion. The observers reported that guards were stationed around the perimeter, unusual for a simple farmhouse, and that someone appeared to be living in a small structure behind the main building. The intelligence was suggestive, but not conclusive, warranting investigation but not guaranteeing success. Kelly faced a decision that every manhunt eventually requires: whether to authorize a raid based on incomplete information, risking American lives and potentially alerting Saddam if the intelligence was wrong, or to wait for better confirmation while the target possibly moved to another location. Kelly decided to raid, He assembled a task force consisting of Assad operators, soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division's 1st Brigade Combat Team, and Iraqi interpreters, briefing them on the intelligence and emphasizing that Saddam might be present, but confirmation was uncertain. The operational plan called for simultaneous raids on both the Al-Muslit farm and the nearby compound, preventing targets from escaping if one location was hit before the other. The raids were scheduled for early evening on December 13th, time to catch potential occupants during evening prayers when they might be less alert. As the task force loaded into vehicles and helicopters prepared for departure, Kelly reminded the team leaders that capturing Saddam alive was the priority. His trial would demonstrate that dictators faced justice rather than simply being eliminated, but that force was authorized if he resisted or posed a threat. The tension among the operators was palpable, tempered by months of disappointment. Raids that ended in dry holes, or firefights that killed low-level targets, but never the ultimate prize. This felt different. The intelligence was stronger, the pieces fit together more coherently, but no one wanted to speak the hope aloud and risk jinxing the operation. The helicopters landed in fields half a mile from the targets, deploying soldiers who moved quickly through darkness toward the properties. The Al-Muslit farm was searched first, soldiers clearing the main house room by room, while others secured the perimeter and prevented escape. They found Mohammed and several relatives inside, detaining them for questioning, but initial searches revealed no sign of Saddam. The disappointment was immediate and crushing. Another dry hole, another intelligence failure, another operation that would end with nothing to show but detained individuals who might or might not provide useful information. But one of the SAD operators, Chris, noticed something odd as he walked through the courtyard behind the main house. The ground in one corner, near a small mud hut and a metal lean-to used for storing tools, appeared disturbed, as though something had been recently buried or the dirt had settled unevenly. He knelt down, brushing away leaves and debris, and found a frayed rug partially covering what looked like styrofoam or some kind of plug. Chris called for the team leader, and within seconds, soldiers surrounded the area, weapons trained on the spot, while others cleared the nearby structures. Chris pulled at the rug, revealing a circular piece of styrofoam wedged into the dirt, clearly placed to conceal something beneath. He lifted it carefully, exposing a vertical shaft approximately 2 feet wide, disappearing into darkness. The air rising from the hole was warm and carried the smell of human habitation, sweat and breath, and the mustiness of underground confinement. Chris shone his flashlight into the shaft, revealing a narrow passage, descending 6 or 7 feet before opening into a small chamber, barely large enough for a man to lie down. At the bottom of that chamber, a figure sat hunched against the earthen wall, blinking against the sudden light, hands raised in a gesture that was both surrender and disbelief. The man was disheveled, his beard long and gray, his clothing filthy, but his face was unmistakable from thousands of photographs and intelligence briefings. Saddam Hussein, the butcher of Baghdad, looked up at his captors with an expression that mixed defiance and exhaustion. The face of a dictator, reduced to a fugitive, hiding in a hole in the ground. Chris ordered Saddam in Arabic to climb out of the spider hole, keeping his flashlight and weapon trained on the opening, as other soldiers positioned themselves to provide cover. Saddam moved slowly, his body stiff from confinement in the cramped space, grasping at the rough walls of the shaft to pull himself upward. He emerged filthy and disoriented, blinking in the lights now illuminating the courtyard, and stood before his captors with hands raised. One of the soldiers asked in Arabic whether he was Saddam Hussein, a question that was procedural formality because everyone present knew exactly who they had captured. Saddam replied in English, his voice hoarse from months of minimal speaking. "I am Saddam Hussein, President of Iraq, and I wish to negotiate." The statement was surreal in its disconnect from reality. A former dictator who had lost his country, his power, his sons, and his freedom, standing in a farmyard surrounded by American soldiers, and somehow still believing he held negotiating position. Chris replied that there would be no negotiation, only custody and trial, then ordered soldiers to search Saddam for weapons before securing him with plastic restraints. The search of Saddam's spider hole revealed the pathetic remnants of his regime's former grandeur. Inside the underground chamber, soldiers found 2 AK-47 rifles, a pistol, $750,000 in U.S. currency packed in a styrofoam box, and a small bag containing personal items, including a Quran and a few changes of clothing. There was no communication equipment, no bodyguards, no indication of the elaborate security apparatus that had once protected him. The spider hole itself was crude, dug into the dirt beneath a mud hut, with barely enough room for Saddam to sit or lie down, ventilated by a small air pipe extending to the surface. This was where the man who had built palaces across Iraq, who had commissioned golden statues of himself, who had executed thousands who showed insufficient respect, had spent the last months of his freedom, hidden like an animal in a burrow, dependent on a handful of loyalists who brought him food and warned him when American patrols approached. The contrast between his former power and current humiliation was so stark that several soldiers stood staring at him in disbelief, trying to reconcile the disheveled prisoner before them with the image of the strong man who had ruled Iraq for 24 years. Kelly arrived at the farm within an hour of Saddam's capture, brought by helicopter from Baghdad as soon as the task force commander radioed confirmation that they had the target in custody. He walked to the spider hole, looking down into the chamber where Saddam had been hiding, then approached the prisoner, who sat on the ground surrounded by guards. Kelly studied him for a long moment. This man whose regime had murdered hundreds of thousands, who had used chemical weapons against his own citizens, who had invaded neighbors and survived decades through brutality and cunning. Saddam stared back with an expression that was difficult to read. Pride mixed with resignation, defiance undercut by the obvious reality that his capture represented complete defeat. Kelly asked whether Saddam understood that his regime was finished, that there would be no restoration, no negotiation, only trial and accountability. Saddam replied in Arabic, speaking slowly and deliberately, that history would judge who was right and who was wrong, that the Americans were occupiers who would eventually be driven from Iraq, and that his people would remember him as a leader who resisted imperialism. The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, the assertions of a man clinging to narrative because it was all he had left. The intelligence value of Saddam's capture extended beyond the symbolic victory of removing a fugitive dictator from Iraq's landscape. Interrogations conducted over the following months revealed details about the insurgency's early organization, the locations of weapons caches, and the identities of Baathists still coordinating resistance. Saddam himself provided limited cooperation, maintaining a posture of defiance and refusing to acknowledge crimes that international law and human rights organizations had documented extensively. But the psychological impact of his capture on the insurgency was significant, at least initially. Fighters who had believed Saddam might somehow return to power and restore the Ba'athist regime faced the reality that their former leader was in American custody, headed for trial, his image broadcast worldwide, looking defeated and humiliated, during a medical examination that showed him being searched for lice. Some fighters laid down their arms, accepting that the regime they had served was truly finished. Others became more radicalized, transforming their fight from restoring the old order to resisting occupation through sectarian violence and terrorism that would consume Iraq for years to come. The trial of Saddam Hussein began in October 2005, conducted by an Iraqi special tribunal established to prosecute crimes committed during his regime. The proceedings were complex and controversial, complicated by security concerns, political pressures, and debates about victors' justice versus legitimate accountability. Saddam used the trial as a platform for defiance, refusing to recognize the court's legitimacy, delivering speeches about resistance, and attempting to portray himself as Iraq's rightful leader, rather than a defendant answering for atrocities. The prosecution presented evidence of the Dujail massacre, where Saddam had ordered the killing of 148 Shia civilians in retaliation for an assassination attempt, along with documentation of systematic torture, execution, and repression that characterized his rule. Witnesses testified about family members who had disappeared into Iraq's prison system, about villages destroyed during the Anfal campaign, about the culture of terror that had defined life under Ba'athist rule. On November 5, 2006, the tribunal found Saddam guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced him to death by hanging. The execution took place on December 30, 2006, in a facility at Camp Justice, an Iraqi base in northern Baghdad. Saddam was brought to the execution chamber early in the morning, maintaining composure despite knowing he was minutes from death. Witnesses reported that he refused a hood, insisting on facing his executioners directly, and engaged in a verbal exchange with guards who taunted him as the noose was placed around his neck. When the trapdoor opened and the rope snapped his neck, ending his life within seconds, the man who had ruled Iraq through fear and violence for nearly a quarter century became history. Video of the execution, recorded on a mobile phone by one of the witnesses, was leaked and circulated worldwide, showing Saddam's final moments and generating controversy about the dignity of justice versus the revenge apparent in the guards' behavior. The images closed a chapter that had begun decades earlier, when a young Ba'athist revolutionary had risen through Iraq's brutal political landscape to become the dictator whose capture required turning his own spies and supporters against him, reducing him from palace to spider, whole, from power to prisoner. The intelligence officers and soldiers who participated in the manhunt dispersed to other assignments, carrying with them the knowledge that they had accomplished one of the most significant captures in modern military history. Kelly returned to other CIA operations. His role in Saddam's capture, classified but recognized within the intelligence community as an example of patient, methodical intelligence work that combined human sources, signals intelligence, and cultural understanding. Chris and the other SAD operators moved on to other missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. The war on terror, consuming their skills and courage in operations that rarely received public acknowledgement. The Iraqi informants who had provided crucial intelligence, men like Mahmoud and Namik, who had chosen pragmatism or survival over loyalty, disappeared into protection programs or returned to uncertain futures in a country still torn by violence. Some received the rewards they had been promised, relocating with their families to new countries and new identities. Others vanished, possibly killed by insurgents who learned of their cooperation, possibly living quietly in Iraq under assumed names. The consequences of betrayal were complex and personal, affecting not just the informants but their families, their tribes, and their communities, in ways that would echo for generations. The spider hole, where Saddam spent his final months of freedom, was filled in shortly after his capture, the farmhouse gradually falling into disrepair as the war moved on, and Ad-Dar returned to being an unremarkable town near Tikrit. The site became neither shrine nor memorial, just another piece of ground in a country that had seen too much violence and suffering to mark every location where history had occurred. But the image of the spider hole remained powerful, symbolizing the complete reversal of fortune that dictators risk when they build power on fear rather than consent, when they surround themselves with loyalists whose loyalty lasts only as long as the benefits outweigh the dangers. Saddam had trusted that tribal bonds, family connections, and decades of patronage would protect him when his regime fell. And for 8 months, that trust was partially justified. But ultimately, the same forces that had sustained his rule, fear, greed, and the pragmatic calculation of survival, turned against him when American intelligence officers understood how to exploit them. The lessons from the manhunt extended beyond Iraq, informing counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations for years afterward. The combination of patient intelligence gathering, cultivation of human sources, and the willingness to turn enemies into assets became doctrine for operations targeting Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other organizations that relied on secrecy and loyalty for survival. The understanding that everyone has pressure points, family they want to protect, wealth they want to preserve, futures they want to secure, became central to recruitment operations that gradually penetrated terrorist networks and dismantled them from within. The hunt for Saddam demonstrated that even the most security-conscious targets could be found if intelligence services invested sufficient time, resources, and cultural understanding into identifying the people around them and converting those people from protectors to betrayers. It was a template that would be used again and again, refined and adapted, in the manhunts that defined the post-9/11 era. The broader questions raised by Saddam's capture and execution remained unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Whether his trial represented justice or victor's revenge depended on perspectives shaped by nationality, politics, and beliefs about international law. Whether his execution brought closure to his victims or simply added another death to Iraq's mountains of dead was debated by survivors, human rights advocates, and historians. Whether the American invasion that toppled his regime was justified by the atrocities he committed, or was itself a crime that destabilized an entire region, became an argument that consumed policymakers, scholars, and citizens for decades. The spider hole could not answer these questions. It was simply the place where a dictator's run ended, where the manhunt reached its conclusion, where one chapter of Iraq's tragedy closed before even darker chapters began. But it represented something concrete in a war that often felt abstract. A moment when a specific individual who had caused immense suffering faced accountability, however imperfect, for the choices he had made and the pain he had inflicted. In the years after Saddam's death, Iraq struggled to build stability from the ruins of dictatorship and occupation. The sectarian violence his capture had temporarily dampened exploded into civil war, killing tens of thousands as Sunni and Shia militias fought for power in the vacuum left by the Ba'athist regime's collapse. The insurgency that had formed during his months in hiding evolved into more sophisticated and brutal organizations, eventually giving rise to ISIS, whose atrocities made even Saddam's regime look restrained by comparison. The American soldiers and intelligence officers who had hunted Saddam watched these developments with frustration, knowing that capturing the dictator had been necessary, but not sufficient to prevent the chaos that followed. Some questioned whether the entire enterprise had been worth the cost in lives, money, and regional stability. Others maintained that removing Saddam was morally imperative regardless of consequences. that dictators must face accountability, even when their removal creates new problems. The debate continues unresolved because history rarely provides clean answers to questions about whether specific actions were right or wrong, justified or catastrophic. What remains indisputable is the dedication and skill of the men and women who conducted the manhunt, turning what seemed like an impossible task into a methodical intelligence operation that succeeded through patience, cultural understanding, and the willingness to see enemies as human beings with motivations that could be understood and exploited. They mapped networks that most Americans could not comprehend, recruited sources in environments where discovery meant death, and maintained focus through months of failure until success finally arrived. They demonstrated that manhunts are won, not primarily through military force, but through the harder, slower work of understanding people, identifying what they value and what they fear, and creating conditions where betrayal becomes more attractive than loyalty. The spider hole was the end point of that process, the place where intelligence, persistence, and human psychology converged to produce the outcome that 8 months of searching had pursued. It was not glamorous or cinematic in the Hollywood sense, just a crude hole in the ground where a tired, dirty old man waited for the capture he must have known was inevitable. The story of how the CIA hunted Saddam Hussein using his own spies is ultimately a story about the limits of loyalty and the universality of human vulnerability. Dictators believe that fear and patronage can create unbreakable bonds, that people they have enriched and empowered will remain faithful even when the regime collapses. But fear dissipates when the source of fear loses power, and patronage means nothing when the assets are frozen and the future holds only prison or death. The men who protected Saddam for decades, who benefited from his rule and participated in his crimes, made rational calculations when American intelligence officers offered them alternatives to destruction. They chose their families over their leader, their survival over abstract loyalty, their futures over a past that was already dead. Those choices were not heroic or noble. They were human, and understanding that humanity was the key to everything that followed. The spider hole was where Saddam's story ended, but it was also where the story of intelligence tradecraft, patient cultivation of sources, and the exploitation of human nature reached its successful conclusion, a conclusion that would inform manhunts and counterterrorism operations for generations to come.